What if I told you that just 1 minute ago, inside the private chapel wing of Windsor Castle, Princess Anne, the woman who never cried in public, never flinched under pressure, never once let the mask of duty slip, in 50 years of service, quietly performed the single most emotionally devastating act of her entire royal career? What if I told you she walked into that room, knowing it would be the last public role she ever accepted? That the object in her hands wasn't just jewelry, but a family circlet older than the reign of Queen Victoria herself? And that when she raised it above Catherine's head, she wasn't performing a ceremony, she was transferring something the palace had been terrified to lose for over a decade? By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what Anne whispered to Catherine before she placed that circlet on her head, why Charles wasn't in the room, why William stood frozen against the wall, and why every senior aide in Windsor was reportedly told to leave their phones outside. Before we go any further, hit subscribe because this story doesn't just change what we thought about Anne. It changes what we thought about the entire future of the monarchy. The date is the morning of the ceremony. The place, Windsor Castle. Not the state apartments, not the grand halls used for televised occasions, but a smaller, older chamber tucked deep in the private wing. The kind of room the public never sees and the press never films. Insiders say there were fewer than 14 people present. No cameras. No official photographer. No court circular entry planned for at least 72 hours. Only a handwritten guest list and a single sealed envelope that had reportedly been prepared months in advance by Anne herself. To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand who Princess Anne truly is. Not the caricature of the hardest working royal, not the tabloid image of the stern woman on horseback, but the daughter who watched her mother carry the crown for 70 years and learned, in a way no one else in that family ever did, exactly what the weight of duty costs a human being. Anne was born in 1950, the second child of a young queen who would inherit the throne 2 years later. She grew up in a household where feelings were folded neatly and put away in drawers, where affection was expressed through discipline, and where the word duty was said more often than the word love. She was not the heir. She was not the spare. She was, in the cold arithmetic of royal succession, the daughter and daughters, in that generation, were expected to marry well and disappear quietly into the background. Anne refused. She became, by sheer force of will, the busiest working royal in the family. Over 300 engagements a year, more than any of her brothers, more than her parents in their later years. She competed at the Olympics. She was kidnapped at gunpoint in 1974 and famously told the attacker, "Not bloody likely," when he ordered her out of the car. She raised her children without royal titles because she believed titles should be earned, not inherited. And through every scandal, every divorce, every family crisis that swallowed her siblings whole, Anne stayed silent. Anne stayed steady. Anne stayed working. But here's the thing nobody talks about. For the last several years, sources close to the family say Anne had been quietly preparing for something. Not retirement. Anne doesn't retire. Something else. Something more deliberate. Meetings with the Lord Chamberlain's office that weren't on any public schedule. Long private lunches with Catherine at Anmer Hall that lasted 6, sometimes 7 hours. A trip to the Royal Archives at Windsor in early 2025 that was logged under a different name. And most tellingly, a single visit to a jeweler in Mayfair who had, decades earlier, restored a piece of family jewelry that hadn't been seen in public since the 1930s. That piece is what she carried into the chapel wing today. Ask yourself something. Why would the most private, least sentimental member of the royal family, a woman who once said publicly that ceremony without purpose is just theater, spend nearly 2 years preparing a ceremony that had no official purpose, no court sanction, and no press announcement? The answer, according to those monitoring the family's internal dynamics, is devastatingly simple. Anne no longer trusted the institution to protect the future of the family, and she had decided, quietly and without permission, to protect it herself. To understand why, you have to go back to the summer of 2024. Catherine's cancer diagnosis had shaken the palace to its foundations. Charles was undergoing his own treatment. William, for the first time in his adult life, had reportedly told a senior aide that he felt the ground moving beneath him. And behind the scenes, a quiet power vacuum had begun to form. Not on paper, not in any official document, but in the softer, more dangerous currency of the monarchy perception, loyalty, and the emotional center of gravity that holds a royal family together. Camilla, insiders say, moved carefully into that space. Public appearances increased. Private influence expanded. Senior courtiers who had once reported to the late Queen's household began quietly aligning with Clarence House operations. And by early 2025, some of the oldest members of the royal staff, men and women who had served through 3 generations, began describing what they called a soft reordering of the family's inner circle. Anne, according to those same sources, watched all of it and said nothing. Publicly, privately, she began making calls. But here's where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The circlet Anne carried into that room today was not a Camilla piece. It was not a Charles piece. It was not, in fact, a piece belonging to the reigning monarch at all. It was a Spencer-adjacent family heirloom, a delicate diamond and pearl circlet originally commissioned in the late 19th century for a female relation of the family, restored in the 1930s. Worn briefly by the Queen Mother before her marriage, and then quietly retired to a vault in Windsor, where it sat, forgotten, for nearly 90 years. It had no state significance. It carried no coronation weight. It was, in the technical language of royal jewels, a family circlet, meaning it belonged not to the crown, but to the family itself, passed down through the private lineage rather than the constitutional one. And that distinction matters more than you can possibly imagine. Because when Anne raised that circlet over Catherine's head, she wasn't invoking the authority of the monarchy. She was invoking something older, quieter, and, in the internal politics of the palace, far more powerful. She was invoking the authority of the family itself. The bloodline. The inheritance no politician, no courtier, no press office, no consort could ever touch. She was, in the language of those who understand these things, going around the crown. Think about that for a moment. The most loyal, most institutional, most duty-bound member of the royal family, the woman who has spent 75 years never once stepping outside the boundaries, chose the final public role of her career to perform a ceremony that had no official standing, no state approval, and no reigning monarch present. If you've made it this far, hit like, because what happens next is the part the palace has been trying, quietly and without success, to keep contained for the last several hours. The room, according to those who were present, was almost unbearably quiet. Catherine wore no crown, no tiara, no formal jewels of her own. She wore a simple pale blue dress and a single strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. William stood against the far wall, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes fixed on the floor. George, Charlotte, and Louis were seated in the front row, dressed simply, watching their mother with the kind of stillness children only summon when they sense something enormous is happening. Charles was not in the room. Camilla was not in the room. No senior member of the king's household was in the room. Only Anne, Catherine, William, the 3 children, 2 elderly cousins of the late Queen, and a handful of the oldest palace staff, the ones whose loyalty long predated the current reign. Anne walked slowly to the small table at the front of the chamber. On it lay the circlet, resting on a folded piece of dark blue velvet that had once belonged to the late Queen's private jewelry room. Beside it, a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Anne's own careful, unmistakable script. She picked up the paper first, and she read. She spoke about duty, but not the duty of press appearances or ribbon cuttings. She spoke about the harder duty, the duty of holding a family together when the world is watching it fracture. She spoke about Catherine's illness and the grace with which she had carried it. She spoke about the children and how a mother who protects her children is performing the oldest, most sacred royal act there is. She spoke about the future, a word Anne almost never uses in public, and she said quietly that the future of this family did not belong to any single crown or any single reign. It belonged, she said, to whoever had the strength to carry it. And then she looked at Catherine and said the words that, according to those who heard them, no one in that room will ever forget. You did not ask for this. That is precisely why it belongs to you. The silence that followed, one witness said, felt like the whole castle had stopped breathing. Anne set the paper down. She lifted the circlet with both hands, and in a gesture so simple, so unadorned, so utterly unlike the pomp of a state occasion, she placed it gently on Catherine's head. Catherine did not move, did not smile, did not cry. She simply closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, William was already walking toward her. He took her hand. He did not speak. He didn't need to. And Anne, for the first time that anyone present could remember, allowed a single tear to fall. Think about that. Princess Anne, the woman who did not cry when she was kidnapped, who did not cry when her marriage ended, who did not cry, publicly, even at her mother's funeral. That Anne cried because she understood something the rest of the world was only beginning to grasp. This was not a ceremony of celebration. This was a ceremony of transfer. Anne was not crowning Catherine as a future queen consort. The title will come in its own time, through its own official channels. She was doing something far more intimate and far more dangerous. She was naming Catherine, in the private language of the family itself, as the emotional and moral center of what remains of the House of Windsor. The new family leader. Not by title, not by law, by blood, by loyalty, and by the quiet consent of those who have watched this family longer than anyone else alive. But here's where it gets even more chilling. Within 20 minutes of the ceremony ending, according to sources inside the palace communications office, 3 separate calls were placed from Clarence House to Windsor. One to the Lord Chamberlain, one to the King's private secretary, one to a senior figure in the palace press operation. The tone of those calls, one source described, was not angry. It was something worse. It was afraid. Because Charles and his household had reportedly not been informed of the ceremony until it was already underway. And by the time anyone in the king's inner circle understood what had happened, the moment had already passed. The circlet had already been placed. The words had already been spoken. The witnesses, some of them the oldest and most respected voices in the palace hierarchy, had already seen it with their own eyes. You cannot unwitness a coronation, even a private one. And this, insiders say, is what makes Anne's final public role so extraordinary. She did not ask permission. She did not seek approval. She did not clear it through the press office or the Lord Chamberlain's office or the King's private secretary. She simply did it. Because she had decided, long ago and entirely on her own, that the family she had served her whole life needed a new center of gravity, and that the reigning branch, for reasons Anne apparently no longer felt comfortable overlooking, was not going to provide one. Ask yourself something. What does it mean when the most institutionally loyal royal in living memory chooses her final public act to work around the institution itself? It means something has broken. Not publicly. Not visibly, not yet, but somewhere in the deep architecture of the monarchy, something that used to hold has stopped holding. And Anne, in her final act of duty, was not repairing it. She was building around it. The ripple effects have already begun. Within hours of the ceremony, palace staff who had served for decades were reportedly told not to discuss what they had witnessed. But those who have followed this family for years know exactly how palace silence works. The tighter the lid, the louder the leak. And by tomorrow morning, according to those monitoring the family's internal dynamics, the story of what Anne did today will begin to move through the corridors of the royal press pack in whispers, then in fragments, and then inevitably in headlines. The palace that built its entire identity on control was no longer controlling its own house. And Catherine, quiet, careful, deliberate Catherine, the woman who has never once in her 20 years inside this family spoken publicly out of turn, now wears, in the private records of the House of Windsor, a circlet that belonged to a lineage older than the current reign. She did not ask for it. She did not campaign for it. She did not even, according to those close to her, know until very recently that Anne had been preparing it for her. But she accepted it, and in accepting it, she became something the palace machinery cannot easily undo. She became, in the eyes of the family's oldest witnesses, the one they will follow when the reign of the current king inevitably gives way. Not the next queen, not the next consort, the next leader of the family itself. The moral center, the emotional anchor, the one whose word, in the quiet rooms where the real decisions get made, will carry the weight of the bloodline behind it. And Anne? Anne has done what she came to do. Sources close to her say she has already informed a small circle of confidants that today's ceremony will be her final public role of this kind. She will continue her patronages. She will continue her charity work. She will continue, in the way only Anne does, to appear at engagements the rest of the family finds too small, too regional, too unglamorous to attend. But the ceremonial part of her life, the part where she stood as a symbol, as a representative, as a voice with institutional weight, that part, she has now handed on to Catherine. And here is the line that, more than any other, captures what happened in that room today. One of the elderly cousins of the late queen, when asked afterward what she had witnessed, is reported to have said only this: Anne didn't crown a princess. She crowned a mother. Think about that. In a family where crowns have always meant power, Anne chose to redefine what a crown means. She placed a circlet not on the head of a woman who will one day sit on a throne. She placed it on the head of a woman who is raising the next generation of the House of Windsor. Because Anne understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in that family, that the future of the monarchy will not be decided by kings. It will be decided by mothers, by the values passed to George and Charlotte and Louis, by the stability of the home they grow up in, by the quiet, unbroken thread of family love that survives every scandal, every headline, every political convulsion the institution weathers. Catherine is that thread now, officially, privately, in the eyes of those who matter most. And that is what Anne, in her final public role, made unmistakable. But there is one more person we haven't talked about yet. One figure who was not in that chapel today. One name that has been circling the edges of every internal palace conversation for the last several months. And what happens next, the response, the countermove, the fallout from the household that was not informed, may be even more shocking than what happened in that room today. Because the palace does not accept parallel authority. It never has. And the question that every royal watcher will be asking by tomorrow morning is the one nobody in the king's inner circle wants to answer out loud. What does Charles do now? If you've made it this far, hit like, because stories like this don't stay buried for long. And the next chapter is already unfolding behind the walls of Buckingham Palace as we speak. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because when a woman like Anne breaks 75 years of institutional silence to perform a ceremony no one authorized, it isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of one. And somewhere tonight, in a small chapel wing of Windsor Castle, a circlet older than the reign of Queen Victoria rests on the dressing table of a woman who never asked for it. And a princess named Anne, for the first time in her long, disciplined life, has finally, quietly, and completely let go.